Tel Aviv and speak to Tom Gross, a Middle East analyst. Tom, what's the situation now? Have the demonstrations died down?
Well, we're expecting many more demonstrations today. In fact, the estimates overnight were that up to 700,000 people took to the streets spontaneously of various Israeli cities. If so, that would probably, I believe, be the largest demonstrations in Israel's history. Remember, Israel's population is under 10 million, so that's probably more than 10% of the adult population of Israel on the streets. So there is certainly a lot of opposition to the government and the proposed reforms. On the other hand, there is, I think, a silent majority that neither wants the reforms to go ahead so quickly and in full, but on the other hand, they don't want violence, they don't want these protests. The Netanyahu government did win an election narrowly, but they won it in November. So it's not clear whether the demonstrators actually represent a majority of public opinion. However, among them are key elements of society. We have key people from the military, from the intelligence, from the high-tech sector, and these elements of the Israeli society means it's very hard for Israel to function without them. So this is not a kind of working class or religious protests. These are the kind of bread and butter, the people that make Israel successful, that make it tick. They're the people demonstrating.
Tom, with Yuli Edelstein, the head of the Parliament's Foreign Affairs and Defence Committee, speaking out against the legislation. Now we've got Yoav Gallant, who's also a member of the Likud party and still a lawmaker, but not defence minister anymore. Do you think it's likely that there'll be some kind of, well, let's say significant enough dissent within the Likud party itself to stop this from going through and becoming law?
Well, yes. The thing is, actually, Netanyahu himself is one of the more moderate people within his own party, and it is said that he himself would like to halt the legislation. The problem for him is that many people in his own party, and indeed his coalition parties to the right of Likud, they may bring down the government if it does not go ahead. So he may want to freeze or halt the legislation, which will satisfy some of the opposition parties, but he may lose power because the justice minister may resign and various other people may vote against the government. So Netanyahu. So I don't think the judicial reform is likely to go ahead at this point, although a lot of people would like a watered down version. Benny Gantz, one of the opposition leaders, said that 80% of Israelis support 80% of these proposed reforms. The problem is the other 20% of the reforms, which the opposition view as a danger to sort of checks and balances and democracy. So you're right that the moderates in the Likud may, including Edelstein, who you mentioned, and Gallant, may vote against the reform, and the reform may not happen. But that leaves Netanyahu in a very difficult position because he loses a lot of his other side of his party if that is the case.
Tom, let me ask you two questions in one and try to join them together if you think it's a legitimate way of answering this question. The kind of people who are protesting, some people say the left wing has awoken again. But then the other issue being that there's an analysis that actually Netanyahu, while you say he's moderate in Likud, because of his coalition, may be turning the country into a theocracy, because some of his far-right coalition members, it said they don't listen to the people, they listen to the rabbis. So in terms of the protesters and what's happening to the state of Israel itself in its very soul, there's certainly got to be a connection, hasn't there?
Yes, although on the face of it, these protests about judicial reform, behind it is a kind of culture war for the future of Israel. Should it remain a liberal democracy, a more secular state, or should the increasingly right-wing religious settler elements get more and more power and introduce not a theocracy necessarily, but more religious kind of legislation? So behind all this is a kind of culture struggle. And I think most Israelis would like a sort of centrist unity government. Part of the problem is the electoral system allows these little parties, these little far-right parties or religious parties to hold the balance of power in the coalition. And that's what I mean by Netanyahu himself is pressed from both sides, he's also pressed by his own coalition partners into sort of pulling him to more right wing. Or, he himself is a secular Jew. He's not a religious in any way. So there is definitely behind all these protesters a struggle between religious and secular. That's what's really happening.
Tom, really appreciate the analysis. Thanks so much indeed. Tom Gross in Tel Aviv.
Thank you.